Hello, computer.
This is Hello Computer, a series of interviews carried out in 2023, at a time when artificial intelligence appears to be going everywhere all at once. Our next interview is with Rob Sparrow of Monash University in Australia.
I'm Rob Sparrow. I'm a professor of philosophy at Monash University, where I work on the ethics of new technologies. I've been writing about the ethics of robotics and AI actually for a couple of decades now. I'm a critic of autonomous weapons systems. I'm a critic of aged care, robotics. I've written on military simulations and video games. And in general, I'm looking to see what kind of contribution philosophy, and especially political philosophy, can make to debates about the impacts of new technology on our lives.
So you've had lots of conversations, I imagine, over the last few months about AI. Have people raised their suspicions of AI with you?
Absolutely. I guess that is something that has characterized this year, is all the excitement about generative AI and ChatGPT in particular. I've been having lots of conversations about the impact of that technology on teaching, which I think will be very radical and may well be to the detriment of education unless people take some pretty dramatic steps to change the way we do assessment practices. I've been a little bit shocked by the rate of progress of that technology. I've also been struck by how for, I think, about 50 years, philosophers have been talking about the Turing test as a test for intelligence. And now we've got a machine that can pass it. And as far as I can tell, very few people have concluded that these systems are intelligent. So that's been interesting as well, to see how when push came to shove, people were more willing to say of a system that was capable of natural language conversation, it's still just a machine. It's just, making clever use of text data from the internet. And they didn't conclude, as Turing thought, that it was intelligent, or could think, I guess was the way he put it.
Do you think the Turing test was ever useful? I mean, is it a farewell to the Turing test and it's something we're going to miss, or what was it?
I think people will still try to rescue the Turing test. I mean, it's one thing for a machine to be able to talk for a short period or in constrained circumstances and appear human. It's another thing for a longer conversation or a more probing conversation. But it's another thing for a machine to be able to present as human in that context. I think the Turing test is still useful because it highlights the role played by essentially behaviorism in engineering. And a lot of engineers, if you ask them to do something, their standard is good enough that people can't tell the difference. So, you want me to make an intelligent machine, I'll make a machine that you can't tell isn't intelligent. But that further step about whether there's anything sort of behind or inside the black box is something that engineers are often a little bit unwilling to speculate about. And that was always a dodgy argument. I mean, just because I can't tell the difference, at night in fog across the street, I see a human figure and I think, oh, look, there's my friend Jack. Turns out to be a mannequin in a shop store window. Doesn't mean that thing was Jack, just meant that I wasn't capable of telling the difference. And the Turing test is useful for reminding, or the literature on the Turing test is useful for reminding ourselves that appearance isn't reality, and our inability to distinguish between two things doesn't mean that they're the same.
It must be a particularly fascinating time for you, given the disciplines that you cover in your work. Because the Turing test does say a lot about, what we project onto robots, perhaps in the past would have been the thing. You've written about robots, haven't you? I mean, you've written about, is it good that if people could kick a robot, or should they kick a robot? Is it good to kick a robot?
Not only can people kick robots, but they do kick robots. And actually, there's a little bit of an emerging literature on people's tendency to vandalize robots when they're left in public spaces. When people are talking about robots and when people are talking about AI, they're often really telling stories about us. Or that we pretend we're talking about machines, and the real topic is is ourselves. And so, I mean, that's kind of been a focus of my work, has been to look at what the stories we tell about machines and what the nature of the machines that we build reveals about ourselves. So in particular, I've been interested in the race of machines and the way, the future is always represented as white. Robots always have these white skin tones. They're almost always male, except in very specific use scenarios like the cleaning robots or the nursing robots or the sex robots will be women, but all the other robots will be these very masculine figures. And again, that says something about the society that is building robots than about the essence of the robot. As part of what these machines reveal about us, I do think it can say something about me if I mistreat a robot. And I think that I can actually reveal myself to be, for instance, an impatient person or an aggressive person. And those are bad things. We shouldn't be impatient. We shouldn't be aggressive. So I think it can be wrong to kick a robot for what it reveals about oneself. I think in some cases, say I kicked all the robots with dark skin tones and I was obsequious towards all the white-skinned robots, that might reveal me to be racist, for instance. But I don't think we can hurt the machines themselves. I don't think there's anything inside the machine. I don't think these are sentient entities. I don't think they'll be sentient for a long time. So I don't think we're causing the machine to suffer. I mean, we might upset third parties who've just bought an expensive robot and then I trash it. Mostly, I think what is morally, what we should evaluate morally is what it says about someone that they treat a robot like that.
The actions that we're taking with AI and robots speaks a great deal about what we as a society are perhaps secretly thinking. Is that right?
Certainly, this was one of the claims made about big data. Famously, people tell this story about Netflix. They asked people what films they wanted, and they all said very highbrow films. And then they looked at the films that people actually watched. They're all very lowbrow films. People have made similar points about, social media, engagement with pornography. You can see, you can learn something about people. I'm hesitant to say that that's what people are really thinking. There are some value judgments involved there. And it may be that I really do want to watch highbrow films, but I suffer from a terrible weakness of will at the end of the day. Or, I'm tired, or I'm worried about what other people will think of me. My kids are in the room. There's all sorts of reasons to be a little bit suspicious of that claim that, oh, gotcha, we know what you really think because the data reveals all. But in general, AI robots, they're cultural artifacts. They come to us with a long history from science fiction, and the science fiction around robots is very obviously about fears of the working class and fears of anti-colonial uprising and slave rebellion. That's the classic story of the rise of the robots is really the slave rebellion. And those stories were ways to work through cultural anxieties about labor, class, and about race. And so you look to the history of that science fiction, reveals something about culture at the time. But of course, when you ask engineers to build a technology, particularly a sort of high technology, they think, I've got to build something that's futuristic. Well, where does the future come from? It comes from science fiction. So people try to realize those sort of dreams of science fiction, and those dreams from science fiction have all this history of racism and sexism and cultural anxieties to them. So yes, we are building a future often on the basis of some not very well thought through narratives that were popular, not something like Asimov's laws of robotics, for instance, which people are constantly talking about when they talk about the ethics of AI. those are very clearly devices for generating narrative tension. They're not a serious ethics for robots. And, it drives me wild to see so many people read those as though they're a serious proposal for robot ethics, when actually what they are is a serious mechanism for generating stories about robots.
That's a fascinating take on things, and very clear, I think, to a lot of people. Yeah, the Asimov's laws of robotics just don't stand up to scrutiny, do they, these days? I mean, they could absolutely do harm to other people if they were just told to do that. In fact, aren't we seeing autonomous vehicles now in action in the military that are designed to take lives? Is that the case?
We're certainly seeing the development and arguably the deployment of autonomous weapon systems, or, I wrote a paper called Killer Robots in about 2000. I think I wrote it in about 2004, came out in 2006, 2007, looking at the ethics of so-called autonomous weapon systems. But again, I'd resist the claim that Asimov's laws don't stand up to scrutiny, because I simply don't think they were intended as a robot ethics. I think they were intended as a hook to hang stories on. What happens if this principle comes into conflict with that principle? So it would be wrong, again, to say to Asimov, oh, look, you failed to give us good robot ethics, because I don't think that was ever his intention. Having said that, there are clearly desperately important and urgent ethical issues raised by both the use of computer-controlled weapons to select targets and kill people, but also by our daily use of robots. Famously, lots of people have talked about driverless vehicles and who they might kill, etc. It's actually interesting to think about whether it matters whether a technology is designed to kill or not, because people often have quite inconsistent intuitions when they're talking about driverless vehicles and when they're talking about autonomous weapon systems.
Could you give us some examples there?
So one thing is people's willingness to embrace a straightforwardly utilitarian perspective, by which I mean look at the consequences of a machine making a certain sort of decision. So you could program your driverless vehicle to crash into a telephone pole, killing you, whenever the alternative was to kill two people in another vehicle standing by the side of the road. People are very reluctant to embrace that as a principle, I think understandably so. But interestingly, in the debates about, for instance, whether or not autonomous weapon systems might be capable of complying with what's called the principle of distinction. And the principle of distinction essentially says it's a principle embedded in international humanitarian law, or the law of war, also in what's called just war theory, which is a philosophical framework used to guide our thinking about war. So the principle of distinction says you should never deliberately target non-combatants. Don't aim at the civilians. You can kill civilians kind of by accident, as it were, or even knowingly if you're targeting an enemy military force, but you're not allowed to, for instance, deliberately bomb civilian targets. And there's a lively debate about whether or not machines might be better capable of performing that task than human beings. In some circumstances, human beings turn out to be quite bad at that. There's lots of evidence that soldiers will fire at anybody and anything in the heat of combat. Not everyone. Some people are very careful to comply with the law of war, but the human standard of performance isn't necessarily great. And in some circumstances, not all circumstances, you can imagine a machine might do better. Now, for some people, that's enough to justify using an autonomous weapon system. It would kill fewer civilians than using a human being in the same task. So that's a utilitarian principle. I personally think that in wartime we actually owe even the enemy more than that, and so And actually, we expect more than that of human warfighters. We don't say to them, target fewer civilians than the bloke next to you. We say never deliberately target civilians, which suggests that what we expect of human beings is actually perfection, even though we won't know they won't achieve it. And so we should expect perfection from robots. We know they won't achieve that. So that would be an argument against the use of autonomous weapon systems.
And does this lead us to the minotaurs that you've written about? And let's explain what's the difference between a minotaur and minotaur. How do you pronounce that? It's not a word I say out loud very often.
We need to ask a scholar.
Okay,
I believe I say minotaur.
Minotaur. It's a terrific image, though. We can see this bipedal minotaur standing there. So, what's the difference between a minotaur and a centaur when it comes to AI and robots and human beings working together in warfare?
So, I've written recently about these two figures or images for imagining the future of manned-unmanned teaming. And so more and more robots, more and more automation, more and more AI is emerging in the military. There's lots of enthusiasm for these technologies. There's a sense that these might determine who wins wars in the future. So there's a bit of an arms race around AI and robotics. But when you go to a highly trained, highly skilled profession like the military, but also like doctors or engineers, and you've got some robot that you think might be able to do some of their job, you never go to them and say, look, this is going to put people like you out of work. It's going to take away your job. What you say to them is, this will do the boring stuff. This will do the grunt work and leave you to do the bits that you love. And I think that's often a little bit disingenuous. And one of the things that we've discovered about robots and AI is that the physical world is really hard for machines, whereas almost anything that can be done online, an AI is capable of doing now. But walking into the room that I'm in and picking up an object, for instance, that's a task that a young child can do, but we don't have robots that have that kind of performance. So it's often the case that actually machines threaten those parts of people's jobs that involve the sort of cognitive skills, the mental work. So when people are essentially selling robots to the military, they have mobilized this idea kind of from the Iron Man films that you'll have one human being leading a team of robots, and the robots will go into battle, but it'll be a human brain commanding them. And that has been described as centaur warfighting, from the idea that you've got a human, head and torso on the body of a horse. The machine does the physical stuff and the human being does the mental stuff. I actually think it's likely to be the other way around in some contexts. And so that's what I've called a minotaur, which is the minotaur was a mythical creature with the head of a bull on the body of a man. And so I think in some contexts, we're more likely to see essentially AI commanders. I think they'll emerge as advisory systems. And so you'll imagine being in the infantry and you'll have your HoloLens, your augmented reality goggles, and you'll be getting, advice, advance 50 meters, turn to left, fire on this target. That is what that technology is being developed to do, things like threat assessment and mission planning. But I think those tasks will be taken on by computers, and the actual, lugging heavy bits of gear through the mud and clambering over logs and clearing buildings will be done by human beings. So yes, I think the future of manned-unmanned teaming, actually in lots of contexts, we kind of see this with Uber already. If you think of, people thought that we would have robot taxis. We'd have robot cars. Maybe that future will still emerge, but I would be in charge of the robot car and the machine would do my bidding. At the moment, what we have is an algorithm telling people where to drive. The car is still driven by a human being, but they're essentially following orders, the orders of an algorithm. So what we have is a minotaur there rather than a centaur.
I don't know which is the more terrifying shorthand, the Uberification of war or autocomplete for armies. It does sound like we're without proper conversation, we are allowing ourselves to walk down a potentially very dark path. Does that sound accurate?
Yes. I mean, I am afraid of where these technologies are heading. I think that we've got a pretty clear sense that artificial intelligence is at the very minimum a powerful surveillance technology. You know, there was a historical moment where people thought that putting everything online, having all these sort of cameras in our pocket was going to democratize everything. You know, we would replace all the newspapers with citizen journalism and there'd be this, you know, we'd do all our democracy online and we'd be vigorously debating things. You know, we've got a couple of decades of evidence now that over that period, we've seen this tremendous collapse of newspapers, centralization of media power, online debate turns out to be horrible. So in a similar way, I think what we know about AI is it's a very centralizing technology in many ways, and it will empower governments relative to their citizenry to make some forms of protest or even revolution much, much harder. You know, if you think about the sort of classic surveillance of the Stasi, that was quite, in East Germany, that was quite hard work. I mean, they built a very effective police state. You can do that much more easily now using AI. And so, you know, that is for me a frightening prospect. I do think, it's good when soldiers refuse to fight in some circumstances. It's quite hard to get people to fight in unjust wars. Soldiers will often simply refuse, and some of those soldiers in the future will be machines. Maybe some of them will still be human beings being guided by machines, but also some of the things that you would expect human beings to care about when, for instance, they order people to their deaths, you wonder whether machines will really care about that. If the best way for me to win for an artificial intelligence is to win a battle is by sacrificing some troops, may do that without a qualm. Now, I mean, human generals have done that too, but you hope that they cared about it. Again, a lot of this stuff is about how we think of and treat each other and the relationships between people. And I worry about the impact that AI will have on those relationships.
And you have said that it's a healthy sign of democracy that we show suspicion in some cases, that it's okay for us to be suspicious. Is that right?
Absolutely. Liberty is hard won. Historically, it was won by trade union movement, the feminist movement. People have had to fight for the good things that we have. The welfare state, such as what there is of it left, and civil liberties. Those things were all fought for by people against powerful interests, and often against the common sense of the day. I mean, it's really shocking, for instance, what people used to say about, allowing women to participate in politics. For instance, you don't have to go that far back before the sort of, all the liberal, even the progressive newspapers are saying, that's kind of madness to think that women could be men's equals and participate in public life. And, people were rightly suspicious of that claim and fought to overturn it. And our new common sense is a common sense of equality. So one of the things that people say about AI, and they said it about robotics, and they've said it about any number of technologies, is that these are revolutionary technologies. These are technologies that will change everything. And so one of the things I always ask people to imagine is to imagine like a sort of 70s style urban guerrilla, someone with a balaclava on, clutching an AK-47, and then they say everything that the kind of techno enthusiasts say. They say, you know, in the next 10 years, we'll put 40% of the population out of work. You know, we will radically change the way people live. We will upend education. We'll move fast. We'll break things. And if somebody said that in a obviously political context, you wouldn't say, oh, bravo, you know, that's fantastic. I can't wait. I'd better get ready for that future. What you would say is, who put you in charge? So the more powerful these technologies are, and the more powerful they're represented, the more people should demand a say as a matter of right in whether these technologies are developed and what shape they have, because it's our lives that are going to be upended. We shouldn't hear about a revolutionary technology that will change everything and not be suspicious of that, and not ask who is going to be privileged and who is going to be oppressed in that brave new world.
This is fascinating. And it gets back to us projecting onto technology as well, yeah? I mean, you're just basically saying, if we pretend the robot's wearing a balaclava and all of a sudden everything that gets said takes an entirely new context, but that's our projection, yes?
It's not that we should pretend that the robots are in the balaclava. We should pretend that the people who talk about technology as though it were this non-political, you know, inevitable historical progression, as though it was somehow change driven by technology wasn't political change and shouldn't be evaluated politically. So it's when, you know, Elon Musk or, you know, Bill Gates, it's when they say, you know, a fourth industrial revolution is just around the corner, instead of seeing them as these sort of outside of politics, we should imagine that they were genuinely revolutionaries, and they were, and we should see it we should hear it at least sometimes as a threat, not as a promise. I mean, maybe we should embrace this stuff, but what we shouldn't do is just think, oh, well, my way of life is going to be completely transformed. You know, my children will have no job, you know, and, you know, it'd be great because I've got an iPhone. I mean, what we should think is, who's in charge of this? Is it something that I want? What alternatives are we forgetting about?
This is fascinating. So it's like the word revolution 200 years ago had none of the funky positive connotations that it might have today. Whereas today, maybe the word revolution has lost a lot of its meaning.
I mean, if you genuinely threaten our society with revolution, you know, or if the powers that be imagine that the population are going to rise up and overthrow them, then they take it very seriously. And if you think about the kind of crackdown on social dissent, particularly around climate change protests, but also, you know, the Republican movement in the UK, in some contexts, people take revolution quite seriously. But what I don't think they mean it when they talk about technological revolution, or they want us to forget that revolution is always political. So that if things change, if people are put out of work, if we, you know, For instance, if we all start working from home and we essentially give over all the time that we used to spend traveling, that becomes work time, but no one's paying us to do that. That is a significant shift in power in the workplace and who's getting paid for what. And so these kinds of technologically driven change, they make real difference to people's lives, and that's what we should be paying attention to.
So you've done a lot of work on video games, or a lot of research into video games in the past, and of course we all know that video games are getting more and more realistic. And so is there a blurring of the lines within video games as well, particularly as I imagine that AI are going to become major parts of online gaming and offline gaming perhaps? What do you see happening there?
I'm very concerned about digital companions. So the potential of generative AI that may be combined with the increased our increasing ability to generate images to create individualized kind of imaginary friends for people. I think that is something that we need to be looking at really closely. You can imagine that having quite significant implications for people's mental health. I mean, interestingly, one of the places where these technologies are being developed and advertised is precisely for therapy. But if something can have has causal power for good, it can also have causal power for evil as well, or to harm people. And it is really interesting how, to go back to video games, for instance, people are very reluctant to think that video games might be bad for players. They're very reluctant to say that they are training, not everyone, but there's a significant portion of the media studies community and the gaming community who says, look, I really enjoy pretending to shoot people, but that doesn't mean that I'm any more likely to shoot people. But often at the same time, people will deploy a rhetoric which says that we can gamify and teach people new skills. Indeed, we can make them better people by, for instance, so-called ethical gaming. And the interesting thing there is, if you think that this technology has the power to change people for good, it's pretty strange if you think that it can't also harm people. AI in gaming, I don't think that, because I don't think that the AI is sentient, I don't think that there's anything particularly different. We might end up with more realistic dialogue in games. We might see games that are more responsive to individual users, but I don't think it's going to be any more wrong to shoot the non-player character that has got a sophisticated speech engine in it than it is to shoot one that doesn't. I do think people should think about advertising and the way in the media more generally. And so for someone who's playing a lot of gaming and says, look, this doesn't affect me at all, you've got to wonder why companies that are trying to sell products are doing product placements in video games. Yeah, the guns, people who sell guns are designing the weapons in video games, are bidding to have the kind of, their particular firearm aesthetic represented in the video game because they know that they can sell guns. So if this technology shapes people's behavior so they're more likely to buy a certain sort of pistol because they've seen it in a game, it's kind of hard not to think that it might affect you in other ways. And then the other comparison here is to think about is, are there any limits to the sorts of activities that you would be willing to enjoy fantasizing about or pretending in a video game? So, for instance, a lot of people are comfortable playing first-person shooters, so it's okay to fantasize about killing people or enjoy pretending to kill people. But if you impose an overtly racist narrative over the top. And, the point of this game is to, shoot all the people who have this particular skin tone or who look like this. And it's not just that the game is kind of racist in the way that all the terrorists are, Arabs in that sort of classic way that many Hollywood films have been racist, but it's actually explicitly, the aim of the game is to hunt down and kill people of a particular race. A lot of people back right off at that point. And if you then add kind of sex crimes into the mix, and a game where the goal was to commit a sexual assault, and historically there have been some games like that, a lot of that, this is just good, clean, harmless fun, I don't want to do it in the real world stuff, actually falls away, and people are much more conscious of what it says about them that they enjoy this stuff. Now, the ethics of representation, the ethics of pretending, the ethics of fantasy, these are all very difficult and complicated topics. I'm not saying that those are the last words on those topics. So imagine that you discover that your boyfriend or girlfriend really likes reading true crime stories, and they're lying next to you in bed and they're laughing and big smile on their face, and you ask them why, and they say, isn't this amazing? This guy pulled out his victim's teeth and he, mutilated the corpse, and I really love it. And then think about that the next time, you're smiling because you've just shot someone in the head in kind of Call of Duty, and you what a great headshot, and you screenshot it, send it to your mates, so you put it on, upload the video, and you think, well, how is that different? In both cases, you're doing something that you wouldn't want to do in the real world, and it's clearly morally wrong, and yet people are very comfortable with one of those, maybe not so comfortable with the other. Now, again, this is not the ethics of fantasy, the ethics of gaming, the ethics of representation. These are deep and difficult topics, but it is striking how you can change what people feel and think just by pointing out that if it was racism or racist or sexist, murder, they often feel quite differently about it.
These are deep and difficult topics, and I'm going to sum it up by saying that not enough is being spoken about it in society. But do you feel that there's a direction of travel here? The graphics are just getting so much better. We're about to welcome the metaverse. It sounds like things are speeding up in that respect. So what happens? And who's responsible if people aren't talking about this at the government level or at the group level? Then what do individuals have to do? What are they going to have to do if they're going to make it with any sense of normality in their heads in the next couple of decades?
One thing I think we should keep in mind, and in some ways this is another reason for skepticism about the claims about revolution, is that a lot of change in technology which is going on at the moment hasn't actually had that much impact on society. I mean, think about the change that occurred between, say, 1890 and 1910, 1880 and 1920, where you've had, especially electrification, but vast progress in public sanitation, very old school technologies. For some people, many people, that radically changed their lives. Vast influx of people into the cities, extended life expectancy, new political formations, trade union movements, gaining strength from from industrialization. Now think about the period from 1990 to 2010, where you've had this vast amount of progress in information technology, but actually very little change in the way of life. I mean, I often think to myself that my life and my father's life, and I'm, in my mid-50s now, look fundamentally the same in the sense that, he was an academic briefly and then a government scientist. He went into the office, he drove a car into the office, he lived in a nuclear family in a house in the suburbs where he borrowed money from the bank, he took orders from people up the bureaucracy. That's my life. Like actually for all of it's much easier for me to book plane tickets, and I can communicate with colleagues all over the world on email on a very short cycle. But when it comes to the sort of fundamental structure of my life, those technologies have had almost no impact. Now, I mean, almost no impact. You can't say that they've had no impact, and they may have changed the way that I have thought in various ways, but what they haven't done is upend society. Think about the contraceptive pill, for instance, and the implications that had for gender relations. And then think about progress in computer memory has had almost no implications for gender relations. So, I mean, there is a lot of there is a lot of change. And again, I want to say that some of this, maybe all of it, is politically salient and important. But a lot of that rhetoric of revolution, even productivity, there are some people who argue that the development of the internet had very little impact economically didn't actually make people more productive at work. Now, I'm not particularly qualified to judge that, but certainly it's not straightforward that we all got online and everything was wonderful. We all became so much better at everything. That being said, if someone does say, look, this is a new industrial revolution, and we're going to put half the population out of work, that requires a collective conversation. It's not something that people can, opt out of, as it were. And I don't know, if you remember things like, the Hunger Project or sort of collectivism, or, the kind of, or Buy Nothing Day, that kind of enthusiasm for everyone sits at home and adds a widget to their blog, or, posts some kind of, I'm in solidarity on Twitter. That just doesn't cut it. What would be required to roll back power from, to be frank, some of the most wealthy and powerful corporations in the world would be a much more old school political activity, regulation, revolution. It's not going to be about individuals opting out.
What are your thoughts on the high points of popular culture in terms of AI and robots, and what are the low points when it comes to AI and robots?
In some ways, I think this has to be Star Wars, just because of the breadth of, cultural impact of those films, and obviously having these kind of characters that were robots at the center of the original films. One of the things that was striking about that is the way that C-3PO is really very obviously just a version of the Tin Man from Wizard of Oz, but also that you imagine this society with obviously a kind of tremendous AI, machine sentience, but people are still running around with swords, and combat is still about individuals, and that that fantasy that you will have these kinds of humanoid machines, and there'll be no change to even gender roles, because those films were quite sexist as well. that strikes me as being, a bit of a low point. That you could, on the one hand, be so imaginative, and yet at another level imagine so little change.
Subscribe to the Hello Computer channel here on YouTube to hear more interviews with experts as the world comes to terms with thinking machines.